What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back for a second episode, so to speak, of a series I kinda started last week, and that is albums I recommend to beginners of a certain subgenre of heavy metal music. Last week I did death metal, and I kinda went overboard on the albums I chose. I went with 20. And since then, my good buddy Necrotic Nick from the Thralls of Metal did a response to it, and he approached it far better than I did in my video. And first of all, thank you, Nick, for the shout out, and thank you for the sudden surge in subscriber numbers for my channel, and view counts, comments, all that kind of stuff. Thank you very much, Nick. You've been a really good friend over the past few months. Still wished we could have met while I was in Toledo last month, but we'll make it happen somehow, some way in the future. But anyways, so for this second episode I'm doing on like what albums I recommend to a beginner for a certain genre or subgenre in some cases. Well, this time around I was debating on what subgenre to do here, but I decided to go for classic/traditional heavy metal. Now, the term heavy metal encompasses quite a vast variety of styles of metal, but traditional heavy metal sticks to certain ingredients such as melody, yet some aggression, and some catchy hooks and riffs and so on and so forth. And really, traditional metal started when Black Sabbath's first album came out. Now, the way I'm going to approach this video is to kind of give you some traditional heavy metal albums that have a different feel to them, whether it be something that fits more closer to like thrash or speed metal, black metal, folk, what have you. I'll point them out once we get to them. But I figured the appropriate way to start this little list off is to talk about probably one of the most essential albums of all time. And this can also be for a fan of rock music that wants to get into heavy metal but likes it a little bit slower, or doomy as we call it. And that first choice is going to be Black Sabbath Paranoid. After all, I mean, even if you're not a metal fan and if you're just a rock fan, you should know about this album. I mean, a lot of songs on this album get played on classic rock radio stations to this very day. Songs like War Pigs, Paranoid, and Iron Man. Classics, but you also get some deep cuts on here like Planet Caravan, Electric Funeral, which is the most doomy song on the album, and it's a quintessential doom metal track. But even songs like Hand of Doom and the instrumental Rat Salad, ending with Fairies Wear Boots, which is a nice little like swinging jam type of track. So yeah, while this album definitely encompasses everything traditional heavy metal is all about, it has moments of doom within, because some songs like War Pigs and Hand of Doom and Electric Funeral, lot slower, whereas like Paranoid is kind of like a first punk song or even like a speed metal track. And then Iron Man is just iconic. Art in that riff, probably the third most recognizable riff and the third riff that most guitar players want to learn on guitar, along with Deep Purple Smoke on the Water and Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. But yeah, this is a classic album, and like I said, even if you're not a heavy metal fan and you're just a rock music fan, you should know about this album. And if you haven't heard of this album, first of all, how are you here? And second of all, check it out. It's amazing. I could have went with Master of Reality, but I think in terms of like luring a rock music fan into classic metal, I think this album will kind of ease them in just a little bit more. At least to me. Moving on to the next one. Now, let's say you're getting into traditional metal, but you like it a little bit speedier, like borderlining on speed metal. Well, I got the perfect album for that, and that's Motorhead Ace of Spades. I mean, Lemmy and the gang on this album, they really killed it, and I think this was their fourth album, Yeah, their fourth album, 1980, so this is right in the middle of the new wave of British heavy metal, and these guys were seen as one of the leaders of that movement at the time. And, I mean, most people, again, should know the song Ace of Spades. But then you get other amazing songs on here, like Love Me Like a Reptile, We Are the Road Crew, Jailbait. My personal favorite song on here, The Chase is Better Than the Catch. It's like this mid-tempo, groovy kind of song with some catchy lyrics. I mean, Lemmy, yeah, his voice might kind of turn some people away because it is a little bit rough around the edges, a little bit gruff, but there's a tinge of melody in his voice. But yeah, if you like your traditional heavy metal to be a little bit speedier, this is the album for you. Motorhead, Ace of Spades. Now moving into two of the giants of traditional heavy metal. Now this one is going to be more for fans of like epic quality, like more bombastic melodies and bombastic riffs and vocals. Well, these next two albums, well, this one more so than the next one. We'll talk about the next one in a moment, but when you're looking for heavy metal that has some epic quality and a little bit more of a bombastic approach, no one does it better than Iron Maiden and the album The Number of the Beast. After all, this is one of the all-time classic heavy metal albums of all time, not just for traditional metal, but in all of metal. Arguably a top 5 of all time, no question. I mean, yeah, it's got the 3 big hits, Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills, and Hallowed Be Thy Name, but they're so damn good. Songs also like Children of the Damned, The Prisoner being an underrated track, Gangland, Total Eclipse, even the opening track, Invaders and 22 Acacia Avenue, really good songs. There's not a bad song on this album, at least in my eyes. But the song that definitely puts it over the top is the closer, Hallowed Be Thy Name. It's arguably the greatest metal song of all time. And it's so epic, bombastic, yet it has a little bit of a somber quality to it. And it perfectly encapsulates everything heavy metal is all about. Melody, heaviness, aggression, catchiness. It has it all. This album is the total package. At least for me when it comes to traditional heavy metal, so Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast. Now we get into another giant band within the genre, and one of the pioneers, even though they started a little bit after Black Sabbath, but are just as important, and that is Judas Priest. I went with Screaming for Vengeance because this was the big one, the biggest hit for the band, the song You've Got Another Thing Coming. That I could see luring more people into traditional metal through the radio. But then you also got some other phenomenal songs like Electric Eye. The title track was this like hyper-aggressive speedy track. Devil's Child, an underrated closer. Bloodstone, Riding on the Wind. Fever, Pain and Pleasure, Take These Chains. I mean, and even the bonus track Prisoner of Your Eyes is pretty solid too on this version. The remastered from 2001, even though this came out in 82. But Screaming for Vengeance, I mean, I could have went with British Steel as well, because that one's a little bit more commercial sounding, but I wanted to give it to Screaming for Vengeance because it was just the right album at the right time back in the 80s for Judas Priest, and it launched them even further into the mainstream and getting to play stadiums and arenas. And they're still one of the biggest bands in heavy metal going today. They are still going and are about ready to put out another album, which is absolutely incredible. But Screaming for Vengeance by Judas Priest. Now we get into this pick, which kind of ties in a little bit to the Iron Maiden approach and being epic, but yet this one has a little bit more grit and a little bit more fantasy lyrics. But you can't talk traditional heavy metal without mentioning the late, great Ronnie James Dio, and I'm picking Holy Diver. Of course, it has to be Holy Diver because not only does it have two of his biggest hits, the title track and especially Rainbow in the Dark, but he also got some other great ones on here too, like Stand Up and Shout, Don't Talk to Strangers, Straight Through the Heart, top to bottom, this is classic metal perfection. And Dio, this was shortly after his exit from Black Sabbath in the early 80s, after the fiasco with mixing the Live Evil live album, but when he decided to come out with this solo album, it's just as good as his albums with Sabbath back in the early 80s, like Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. But I think this one, in terms of the entire Dio solo catalog, this one and the second album, Last in Line, are like the pillar albums of his solo career. But I give the edge to Holy Diver because there's a couple more hits that can lure people in. After all, metal radio hits are important for, it's like gateway drugs to get people further and dig deeper into metal. After they hear something like Rainbow in the Dark, they'll think, ooh, Stand Up and Shout, I wonder what that song sounds like. So, Holy Diver, it's a classic to this very day. May you rest in peace, the man, Ronnie James Dio. Now, this is going to be an interesting second half, because now we're going to start getting into the ones that definitely would kind of lean into, like, other styles, so to speak. So, starting with this one, if you like to hear traditional heavy metal with a bit more of a sinister vibe and a little bit of, like, a almost prog vibe, well, this album is definitely going to suit you very well, and that's Mercyful Fate, and I'm choosing Don't Break the Oath. I could have went with Melissa, the first album, but I'm going with Don't Break the Oath because I just like it a little bit better than Melissa. But this album, I mean, King Diamond, one of the greatest heavy metal singers of all time. I know my buddy Necrotic Nick is not a fan of his vocals, but I absolutely love that high falsetto because it doesn't sound like a baby squealing. Looking at you, Danny Filth from Cradle of Filth. But anyways, I just think in terms of the songwriting, they really hit their stride on this album. Songs like A Dangerous Meeting, Nightmare, Desecration of Souls, The Oath, Come to the Sabbath. It's just evil traditional metal that some people look at as a black metal album. I don't think that's accurate really at all, because when I think of black metal in the early years, I think of early Bathory, Venom, Hellhammer, that are raw, gritty, and with gross vocals. There is no gross vocals on here. This is more classic heavy metal than anything. It has a bit of that sinister tone, but it also, songwriting-wise, is kind of a precursor to the progressive metal scene that would start around the same time as this album with bands like Queensryche and Fate's Warning. But this album, to me, is near and dear to my heart, and if you're one to get into traditional metal, but you want something that has a bit more evil to it, this is it for you. And to kind of continue on that prog veneer, but also if you want your traditional heavy metal to have a little bit of what would eventually become power metal, or what was becoming power metal at the time, but it still retains a classic metal spirit and feel, but songwriting-wise, kind of like the Mercyful Fate album, has some prog to it, and I would consider this a progressive metal album, but it's got enough classic metal overtones to it that I can put it on this video, and that is In the Hall of the Mountain King by Sabotage. After all, this album, it's just, like, quite a few of these songs are, like, ingrained in my brain, particularly White Witch and the title track. I mean, but also Beyond the Doors of the Dark is fantastic. Devastation, the closing track, Strange Wings, Prelude to Madness, 24 Hours Ago, top to bottom. It's so catchy, yet it's very proggy. It's kind of like proto-power metal, but it still retains that classic traditional heavy metal spirit of having aggression, heaviness, melody, catchiness. Especially the title track. I mean, that's probably my favorite Sabotage song of all time. I mean, that chorus, that classic chorus, endless raids in the hall of the Mountain King. And the music video to it is pretty fucking cool as well. And, of course, John Oliva's voice is amazing. Chris Oliva, rest in peace. An underrated guitar hero in metal history. And this came out of that Florida metal scene that eventually spawned the Florida death metal scene. These guys were kind of a precursor to that whole thing. But yeah, Hall of the Mountain King by Sabotage. 3 left. Now, this next one, I can already hear the keyboards going about this one. But I'm going to mention it here. So, if you're one to get into traditional metal, but you want something that has a little bit of that thrash feel to it, in terms of a couple songs carrying on a bit of a thrash metal vibe, well, I'm going to put it in this list, and you guys can bash me if you want, but I'm going to put it here. The Black Album by Metallica. I think in terms of classic metal in the 90s, as far as like keeping that spirit alive, this album for me did it well. I know this album's very divisive among metal fans. A lot of people love it, and a lot of people hate it. I personally love it because it's still really heavy. Like, yeah, it's the most well-produced analog recording, and it sounds incredible, but the guitar tone is still really thick and chunky. Yeah, some people probably don't like it because it's been on the radio ever since it came out 30 years ago, but there's a reason why those songs are on the radio, because they're great songs. Enter Sandman, The Unforgiven, Nothing Else Matters, even though I personally can never really listen to Nothing Else Matters the same way again after my brother Rue passed away, and we had that song as one of his songs for the Visitation stuff. Same with Wherever I May Roam, but in terms of like Metallica's more traditional heavy metal chops, this was the one where they showed it off the most, because before this, it was still very much thrash metal with some moments of that classic metal tone. But here is when they went full-on classic traditional heavy metal, but still retains a little bit of thrashiness in terms of some of the riffs. And 2 songs that keep that style, like Through to Never and Struggle Within, still quite thrashy for this album, but yeah, it's just got a thick guitar tone, and there are some underrated deep cuts on here. Songs like Holier Than Thou, Of Wolf and Man, The God That Failed, My Friend of Misery. Some of the most underrated Metallica songs come from this album, and they just don't get brought up as much as, well, the hits, but still, top to bottom, not a dull moment on here. I know some people are going to hate the fact that I have it on this list, and some people probably like the fact that I have it on the list too, but if you want to get into traditional metal, this is another one. Kind of like Paranoid and Screaming for Vengeance and Number of the Beast style kind of lure you in quicker because of the accessibility, but yet it's still pretty heavy, so nothing more, nothing less. Now, this next one, I'm kind of reaching on this next pick, so I'm willing to be talked out of it, but I kind of wanted to highlight this. If you want to get into traditional metal that has a bit more of a lo-fi production and a bit more of the folky vibe, well, again, I'm willing to be talked out of this one, but I'm going to put it in here anyways. Bathory Hammerheart. Yeah, like I said, I know I'm probably reaching with this pick, but I chose Hammerheart because this represented the big change in Bathory's sound. Before this, they were one of the first true black metal bands, especially on albums like The Return and Under the Sign of the Black Mark. Bloodfire Death kind of signaled the change that was going to come here, but it was still very much black metal and very thrashy at times. But here, with Hammerheart, they kind of fully realized what they wanted to do with the Viking lyrics, but musically, no real, like, speed moments, no thrash, no real black metal. The only thing that kind of makes this black metal is that the production is more lo-fi than the other ones I've brought up. But in terms of the spirit, the songwriting, it feels very much like a classic heavy metal album. You got some doomier stuff, some groove-oriented stuff at times, or like more of a grooving march, but I just look at this album as like Bathory's step into classic metal and even being a pioneer of what would become folk metal, because there is some folky instrumentation going on this album with tracks like Shores and Flames, Father to Son, Home of Once Brave, One Road to Asabe is one of the best songs of the 90s. I mean, and even that even more folkier approach with Song to Haul Up High. And this album, in this era when Bathory went into that classic metal, folky Viking tone, it divided some people. I know Necrotic Nick wasn't a big fan of the cleans. I love Corthon's clean vocals. Yeah, this album, some of it was a bit rough, but especially on the song Song to Haul Up High, I think his cleans are exceptional. And yeah, so if you like your classic metal to have a bit more of a lo-fi vibe as well as a folkier approach, I'd recommend Bathory Hammerheart. Now for my final pick, I'm going to pick something modern. If you want your classic metal to have a bit more of a modern sound and a modern feel, as well as a bit of epic quality and a little bit of a thrashiness to it, I point to my album of the year for 2020 last year, and that is Eternal Champions, Ravening Iron. I love this album because, and these are young Texas guys that are playing this classic 80s metal, proto-power metal at times, a little bit of thrash, mostly inspired by Metallica, but in terms of classic metal done in today's day and age, these guys, as well as even bands like Visigoth, do it right, in my opinion. But I think Eternal Champion reigns supreme over Visigoth just because, to me, it feels more epic, it feels more aggressive. Songs like A Face in the Glare, the title track, Skull Seeker, Coward's Keep, kind of that more of like a marching tune. Worms of the Earth, kind of keeping that more almost thrashiness. Banners of Ride is almost borderline doomy, like epic doom track. I have almost listened to this almost non-stop since I first heard it on Daniel DK stream, even though I've listened to a bunch of other stuff in between. But Ravening Iron by Eternal Champion, if you're one classic metal in the modern day, this is it for you. And those are my picks for beginners, or for people that want to get into classic or traditional heavy metal that need some guidance. Well, those 10 albums will suit a bunch of different tastes. So I'd be curious to see what other people think about this. So if anybody that's watching wants to make their own list, either make a video and tag me and let me know, or leave a comment below. What would be some traditional or classic heavy metal albums that you guys would recommend to a beginner that wants to get into traditional, classic, heavy metal, whatever you want to call it? But until next time, horns high, and I will see you soon. I do not want candles!
Wow. That's just Levi Christmas getting
Stop it!
on. Like,
I don't want candles! 10 candles? I'm wrecking myself. Screw that.
Myself going to a Christmas department store and just hearing someone over in the other aisle, I do not want candles!
Wow, I have had a brain fart.
I do not want candles!
Just in that voice.
Okay.
Never forget, I do not want candles!
Dick's toy.
No! 10 printers? Are you kidding me? This is the worst! I hate you!
I did not need candles!
I could see that as like a Metallica song. I did not want candles.